Get started, Tom, whenever you feel comfortable.
Okay, thanks a lot, Daniel. Hello, everybody. I'm Tom Christensen. I'm the director of the China and the World program at Columbia University. And I'm very pleased today that we have a special guest as a presenter for our speaker series. And you'll see why she's a special guest. First thing is, she is an assistant professor at a fine university in the American Midwest, Indiana University, which is also the home of another China and the World fellow from the past, Adam Liff. They have a very strong Asia program, and Wendy is assistant professor, and she's May Chair of Chinese Economics at Indiana University. She's an expert on China's foreign economic policy, and she's written cutting-edge work on the role of state-owned enterprises in China's foreign economic policy. She has won a slew of awards and fellowships, including from Harvard University, from Fulbright. She is currently a PIP fellow, a Public Intellectuals Program fellow at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. It's a program that's near and dear to my heart because I helped create it when I was a board member way back when, and it fits the goals of some of the goals of the China and the World program, which is to make scholarly work more digestible and relatable to the policy world, and to introduce scholars to the problems that real policymakers face in addressing challenges in U.S.-China relations. And I can't think of a better representative for that program than Wendy. She has a PhD in government from Cornell University, a master's from Tsinghua University in China, and a BA from Wellesley. The most important thing in her CV, from our perspective, is that from 2018 to 2019, Wendy was a fellow in the China and the World program, and she's a very active fellow as an alum. And we were talking apparently in public before the session today about the importance of community in the China and the World program. And the fellows help each other, and they help the current fellows with their work. And it's been one of the great strengths of the program. And Wendy's very much a part of that and a very active alum. And today she's going to talk about a topic that I have to say sort of combines two of the most hot topics in China studies. One, COVID-19, right? Everyone wants to talk about COVID-19. And the other is Twitter diplomacy. And she's going to do both. She's going to talk about COVID-19 in Twitter diplomacy. So I can't imagine a more hot topic for our audience, which is growing as I speak. I see it's up to 26. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Wendy. Thanks so much for taking the time. And we look forward in the future to having you in person when we're able to do that. But thanks for doing this on Zoom today. And I will chime off, and I will turn my video to a picture.
Thank you very much, Tom, for that generous introduction. And thank you to everyone for taking the time to attend today's talk. You know, I certainly don't take it for granted, given how busy this time of year is, as well as how many excellent Zoom talks there are out there now. So the topic I'll be speaking about today is COVID-19 and China's Twitter diplomacy. And this is joint work together with my colleague, Nicholas Atkinson at Indiana University. And he is here as well. Hi, Nick. So this project, you know, always speakers say that any type of feedback or questions are welcome. For this project, that is especially true because this is very much a new project underway. We've just finished some of the data collection analysis and are writing up some of our findings. So very much appreciate and welcome any suggestions or questions that you might have at the end of the talk. So before I begin a talk about Twitter diplomacy, I want to start by defining what this concept is, just to make sure that we're all on the same page of what we're speaking about. So in this project, we define Twitter diplomacy as a concerted, deliberate effort by government officials to use Twitter to engage foreign audiences on key policy issues. Now, something that's unique about Twitter diplomacy compared to other types of public diplomacy is that it is ostensibly a form of individual to individual messaging. And so you're not reading, simply a press release from a foreign embassy as an individual, but you're getting some type of personalized communication from an individual person, in this case, a Chinese diplomat. Twitter diplomacy has become an important tool for shaping global and domestic narratives about COVID-19 and a whole range of other policy issues by governments around the world. And so today I'll be speaking specifically about China, but certainly China is not the only country whose diplomats are turning to Twitter to try to engage foreign audiences. And we know that, of course, with former President Trump, perhaps the most visible government spokesperson for this new emerging Twitter diplomacy, but certainly there are many others as well. Now, if you're someone like me who has spent more and more time on Twitter as a way of procrastinating, of course, during the pandemic from other things I should probably be doing, you may have noticed some messages like this beginning to appear on your feed. So here we have a message from Ambassador Zhao from Botswana, messages from here from Ambassador Li to Austria, and of course, former Ambassador Cui Tiankai to the US, and Ambassador Huang as well. So there are more and more of these types of accounts and messages by Chinese ambassadors around the world. And it was really this phenomenon that became more and more obvious over the past year that motivated the research question for this study. And so here's some data that we put together showing Chinese ambassador Twitter account creation over time between 2015 and 2020. And so you can see that there are a few early adopters in the early years, but really this phenomenon didn't begin to take off until the past year or two. Now you'll see that there does seem to be a significant increase coinciding with the emergence of COVID-19 in China, and then it spread around the world. But certainly this was a trend that seemed to already be emerging. So we can think of COVID-19 as providing additional impetus to this trend, but certainly it was something that was already underway. And so this phenomenon motivates the research question for this study, which at the beginning is simply about understanding this phenomenon. So we ask, what is the purpose and content of China's Twitter diplomacy about COVID-19? And so today I'll be presenting some of our initial data in answer to that question. And certainly there's a number of other very interesting and more specific questions that we can and do plan to address using the data that we've collected. So in this paper, and by the end of this talk today, I hope to convince you that by combining positive messaging with digital displays of anger, Chinese diplomats, in this case, specifically Chinese ambassadors, are crafting narratives of COVID-19 that promote China as a responsible international leader, while at the same time seeking to foster favorable public opinion at home with Chinese citizens. So let me talk a little bit about the data and methods that we use in this study. So this presentation today and the other work that we're doing is based on an original database of Chinese ambassador Twitter activity. And the starting point for this, we used a commercial software called Twitonomy in order to download some raw data about these different tweets, and then I went through them in order to generate a much more sophisticated data set. And the results I'm presenting here are based on the entire universe. So you could think of this as a kind of census of China's Twitter diplomacy. All active Chinese ambassador accounts, of which there were 29 between June 2019 and July 2020, yielding a total of 32,707 tweets. And so the way we started out working through this data was to first pull a small sample from it, do some inductive work of reading these tweets and seeing the types of things that they were speaking about in terms of themes. And then we developed a codebook and then applied that at scale to the entire database. And so overlapping coding is possible. The coding is not mutually exhaustive. So it may be the case, for example, that there is a tweet that is about the United States and it's also about COVID-19. So it may be about a number of different themes. And then we actually started by reviewing the tweets based on their policy issues. So not only including COVID-19, but a number of other policy issues. And then we went in and we did a second more detailed coding a same approach, developing the code book and then coding at scale for those COVID-19 specific tweets. And at this point in the process, the two of us, we exchanged the data so that we're able to get a second layer of validation by coding and reviewing independently both of those two sets of data. So most of the tweets were in English, given the global audience that the ambassadors are engaging with. Between us, we have some language ability, of course, in Chinese, as well as German and Spanish. So for a lot of those, we were able to do coding directly, but in all cases, if it was a foreign language, we would double check with Google Translate to make sure coding was accurate. If it was a language that we didn't have ability, we went right to Google Translate for those. So what types of themes are we identifying and coding for specific to COVID-19? Well, one of the first main themes that we identified and we began to look at was China's domestic COVID-19 response. And so specifically, this involved official news and statements by top leaders in China about what was happening in China. And so it makes a lot of sense, really, that in the very beginning, when there was so much uncertainty about the pandemic and about the virus and what was happening, that the first response was to really focus on providing maybe not full and complete and transparent information, but certainly some information about the measures that China was taking to curb its spread. There are also statistics about new cases. That became even more prominent as the number of new cases began to fall. And then that was very much a metric that the ambassadors reported on regularly, every day tweeting how many new cases were reported in China. And there are also human interest stories, for example, stories about survivors. We did have a separate coding for heroes because there were a number of stories that focus specifically on the heroic contributions of healthcare professionals and other individuals in China's fight against the virus. And so just to give you an example of a type of tweet that we would have coded as being about China's domestic COVID-19 response, here you see a message here, a retweet by the Chinese ambassador to Zimbabwe, where citing President Xi Jinping, according to this, and saying that the positive trend of China's containment of the virus is really working. So another major theme that we identified in these ambassador tweets was international cooperation. And so these messages tended to really stress cooperation and solidarity. They framed the virus as not only a challenge for China to be dealing with, but really a threat to all of humanity that would require international cooperation and solidarity in order to successfully overcome. And so some other examples of types of things that would prompt us to code a tweet in this way, and if the ambassador was talking about, for example, international meetings and summits, like the Extraordinary China-Africa Summit on Solidarity Against COVID-19, that would be something that we would code as international cooperation. And a lot of times ambassadors would say very directly, we need international cooperation, or countries must stand together in order to overcome this threat to humanity. And so again, here's an example of the types of tweets that we would code as international cooperation. So another theme in the Chinese ambassadors' Twitter messages, and very much a theme in some of the media as well, is China's provision of free personal protective equipment, testing supplies, or medical expertise. And here I should say that at the very beginning of the pandemic, some of the tweets were actually about other countries' donations of medical aid, whether in the form of expertise or PPE, personal protective equipment, to China, but really the bulk were about China's provision of these things to other countries. And sometimes there will also be tweet threads reporting on the activities of Chinese medical teams that were sent to different countries to assist them with their response to the pandemic. And so oftentimes you would see an ambassador sharing images and updates about the numbers of medical supplies that were donated to the countries where they were stationed. And of course, how grateful the public and the government of that country typically was to receive those supplies. And so here's one such example that you see in Canada, where the ambassador is standing there and receiving donations from China to Canada. So perhaps a somewhat surprising theme, but very common in the tweets, was mentions of the World Health Organization, or WHO. And so a lot of the messages affirm China's support for the WHO in leading and coordinating the global response to the pandemic, commentaries by WHO officials, speeches that Xi Jinping gave at the World Health Assembly. And a lot of times, some type of a common double coding we would see is the WHO endorsing something about China's COVID response. And so the WHO would be invoked to add legitimacy and endorsement of China's efforts to combat the pandemic. And so here's an example by Ambassador Xu talking about how support for the WHO is support for saving lives, and that really this is the organization that should be leading the international response to the pandemic, and China fully supporting that. So another type of tweet that we noticed, a theme, was criticisms and expressions of anger. And these included different types of criticisms and expressions of anger. Sometimes they would be direct, where the ambassador themselves would directly say, something like you see here in the example, lies and fake news from Mr. Pompeo, very directly making some critical statement about another country's response to the pandemic, or even individual officials. And sometimes it would be more indirect criticism. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespersons would routinely make highly critical comments or expressions of anger, and then the ambassador would retreat that, maybe with some small commentary up at the top, but sometimes just directly tweeting and amplifying that message. And less common, but something we did also see, is when actors from a given country themselves, so some type of foreign actor, would be critical of their own government or some other actor, and the Chinese ambassador would retweet that critical messaging directly by the foreign actors criticizing other foreign actors or governments or organizations. And so that was another type of criticism and expression of anger that we saw. So we also coded these tweets for a variety of other topics that, due to time limitations, I'm not going to be able to get into in today's talk, but I provide them here because I want you to have a sense of how comprehensive we tried to be in terms of really cataloging fully and accurately the ambassador's tweets. So we look for things like commentary about virus origins and discrimination faced by Chinese citizens or people of Chinese descent around the world related to the pandemic, disinformation, virus information. So just simple information, maybe retweeting some tweet from the WHO giving information about how to protect yourself from the virus. Things like that would be retweeted as sharing information about the virus. Heroes, as I mentioned before, especially medical personnel on the front lines in China, as well as not the medical donation, but the supply and the sale of medical supplies to other countries. That was also a common topic. Now, later, as China became more successful in containing the pandemic, we also noted that a lot of the ambassadors started tweeting about sharing China's experience. And so sharing screenshots of Zoom webinars, for example, where different professionals in China would share their successful experience of containing the virus. Sometimes it would be a list of lessons from China that were written up and then shared with other countries. Also vaccine development and discussion of the effects of the pandemic on the domestic economy in China, as well as the international economy. And there are actually a number of other categories that I wasn't able to fit onto this PowerPoint slide, but I hope this gives you a sense of the types of things that we were looking for in examining these tweets. All right, so now that you've heard about the data and how we've gone about it, now that I've given you some examples about what these tweets actually look like as we went to code them with these various topics, let me now turn to a discussion of our empirical findings from this analysis. And then at the end, I'll wrap up with some bigger takeaways about what we can learn from China's Twitter diplomacy for broader studies of Chinese diplomacy and foreign policy in general. So first, looking at all of the Chinese ambassador Twitter accounts, of that more than 32,000 by the 29 Chinese ambassadors in this time period between June 2019 and July 2020, we found that about 13,000 or 40% of them were about COVID-19. So a full 60% were about other topics. And looking more specifically at some of the time trends for the tweets that were about COVID-19, it's pretty much what you would expect here in terms of the trend over time. No one's really talking about COVID in November 2019, and then we see an uptick in discussion, really peaking in April of 2020, and then gradually declining over time. And we haven't extended our database past July 2020, but I think we could expect that this trend would continue, this trend of gradual decrease over time. So what were some of the top themes? The number one top theme was tweets about China's domestic response. And again, I think this makes a lot of sense. I think it's quite natural because the ambassadors are representing China to a world that really wants to know what is happening in China right now with regard to the pandemic. And so in the beginning, a lot of the information, it was being shared simply to brief or to try to communicate the situation that was happening in China. And then we see a shift with the tweets still speaking about the domestic response as the top theme, but tending to focus a lot more on China's success. And again, those falling numbers of case counts, and really using this as an example to frame a major success of the Chinese government. So the second top theme that we found, about 18% of these tweets spoke about international cooperation. I think this is very interesting and significant as well. So here we see a deliberate effort to definitely take credit for China's success in containing the virus, but also really try to shift the framing of the virus as something that is a Chinese phenomenon or centered in China. They really try to recast it as a shared challenge that needs to be overcome by cooperation between countries. And in that cooperation, China is certainly able to play a leading role on the basis of their successful experience in containing the virus. Another top theme was international medical aid. Again, we know from other studies and other forms of media that this is something that China really wanted to be able to take credit for, these donations, particularly in the developing world for countries that really needed those supplies. And the so-called mask diplomacy was definitely on full display in the ambassadors' messaging about COVID-19 as well. So some other top themes were the WHO and really invoking that organization and their endorsement of most of China's containment efforts to give them legitimacy, sharing information about how to contain the virus, speaking about how important it was, particularly as the US gave less support to the WHO, that China really felt that that would be the organization to coordinate and lead the global response to the pandemic. And there were also some discussion of other countries' responses, but in general, and I think that this reflects a broader trend of not wanting to comment too much and certainly not critically on other foreign governments' domestic activities. And so we saw some discussion of other countries' responses, particularly the countries where ambassadors were stationed, but certainly there were no real extended or a common discussion of what other countries and their officials were doing. So here's just a quick look at how some of these top themes evolved over time. You'll see that the overall trend here is quite similar to the figure that I showed you a few slides back about the overall frequency of these tweets over time. You can see the increase talking about the domestic response and then that gradual decline. And then we see kind of these twin peaks, first in communicating about China's domestic response, what's happening, and then having a lot of positive tweets about how great things are going in China once it seemed that the situation was coming under control. And then the other trends I think are pretty similar for international cooperation, the second most common theme, as well as discussions of international medical aid and WHO. And then I think also naturally it follows our expectation that we would see an increased discussion of other countries' responses as the pandemic spreads around the world. There were more countries responding to it and more ambassadors commenting on those responses. So something that we are looking for is whether the ambassadors seem to really be speaking to the audience of the users in the country where they were based, to the host country, or were they trying to engage global audiences in general and just use Twitter as a kind of megaphone to reach everyone who happened to be on Twitter, whether they seem to be speaking to domestic audiences or Chinese citizens in China and around the world. And with regard to the tailoring to the host country audiences, we found pretty minimal support, that they tended to be focused more narrowly or really trying to tailor the messages to the citizens of host countries. And so there are a few cases in which we saw some exceptions of this, or so it seemed. So in the case of Brazil, which was hosting clinical trials for Chinese developed vaccine, we saw a lot more tweets about the vaccine and good progress on it and the tests and how well it was working. And so that's the picture of the tweet that you see here by Ambassador Yang to Brazil, just giving some updates about the vaccine. And so that seemed to be one example of a case where there was some tailoring of the messages that were being given to that domestic audience because of the particular activities happening in that bilateral relationship. And we did also tend to see developing countries more discussion in ambassadors' tweets about international medical aid. But of course, that may also simply be because they were the ones who tended to be receiving most of that aid from China as well. But overall, we didn't find a lot of evidence that ambassadors were really trying to tailor their messages to the citizens of particular countries. So I'm going to speak next about the criticisms and expressions of anger. Now, overall, this was a very small percentage of the tweets that we looked at by Chinese ambassadors. So we identified about 5% that contained criticisms and expressions of anger. And we had a pretty high bar for what counted as a criticism and expression of anger. And so we're really looking for very, very strong statements like the example I showed you earlier, lies and fake news from Pompeo, things that were very clearly critical and could even reach a level of being considered an expression of anger. And so that was only about 5% of ambassador tweets. Now, that said, perhaps unsurprisingly, given the politics of the bilateral US-China relationship at the time, the vast majority of these critical and angry tweets tended to be about the US, targeting specific US officials or just speaking in general about the US. So these other themes that I had given you examples of before were actually mentioned pretty infrequently, so below the level of 5% or below. And so I'm not going to go through all of them one by one, but I do want you to know that we did look at them as well as we were working through these tweets. So what does this all have to say with wolf warrior diplomacy? There's been a lot of debates about particularly these more critical and angry expressions by Chinese diplomats online. And this phenomenon has been defined by Brandt and Schaefer last year as a quote, new approach among the Chinese diplomatic corps to more aggressively defend their home country online, end quote. And so we thought about, how does the Chinese ambassador's angry tweets, fit or not fit with what others have been discussing as this emerging phenomenon of wolf warrior diplomacy. And now we know in 2019 that there's a memo by Xi Jinping that was directing diplomats to show more fighting spirit. And so certainly this would have targeted and included Chinese ambassadors quite directly. And we also know from the research of Peter Martin, of his recent book, that diplomats are incentivized to use combative rhetoric in order to avoid any suspicion of political disloyalty in China's highly centralized political system. And there's also been some writing by Ming Z, who is a CWP alum as well, about wolf warrior diplomacy. And she writes that, quote, the current regime's emphasis on political loyalty, not professional performance, has driven up the intensity of wolf warrior diplomacy during COVID-19, end quote. And so there seems to be something specific about the crisis of COVID-19 that would be amplifying or feeding into this broader trend that others have also observed of wolf warrior diplomacy. So we find is, I think, complementary to some of the studies out there, but also a little bit different. So many of the studies have looked at individual diplomats outside of the diplomatic corps of Chinese ambassadors. And certainly I have to say that our findings are only based on the statements by ambassadors. And so maybe we would get a different picture if we included other and broader groups of Chinese diplomats in our analysis. But speaking narrowly on the basis of our data about Chinese diplomats, it seems that wolf warrior diplomacy remains relatively rare. So I've just told you that only 5% of all of these tweets about COVID-19 during this period had anything that we could identify as criticism or expression of anger, only about 5% there. And then even for ambassadors that had the most such so-called angry tweets, it was still a relatively a small part of their online commentary. So even the angriest ambassadors were really tweeting most of the time about other things. Now, I know that for wolf warrior diplomacy, you don't have to be angry 75% of the time to be considered a wolf warrior. Even a few very critical tweets can be very powerful. But this is still, I think, a relatively niche phenomenon in terms of what we were looking at with the Chinese ambassadors. And so I did want to show for you, who are the angriest ambassadors according to our data specific to COVID-19. I've listed them out here. We have ambassador to Venezuela, #1, and it's kind of a different assortment. Some of these relationships, and given that we know that most of these angry tweets are directed toward the U.S., maybe it's not so surprising that the ambassadors to Iran and Venezuela are being highly critical and often critical of the U.S. But it's kind of a mixed bag here in terms of where people are posted and how many critical tweets they're putting out. Now, I guess we could also do looking at like the ambassadors who are not angry at all, so people who never seem to be tweeting anything very critical or angry. We haven't done that. But certainly, I think one of the really exciting things about working with this data is instead of speaking of wolf warrior diplomacy in the abstract and then cherry picking a few examples of individual diplomats and then even individual tweets by those individual diplomats, we can really get a more comprehensive picture about this phenomenon. We can have a very sophisticated analysis of individuals and comparing them to one another. And so I know that many people are interested in wolf warrior diplomacy, so I just want to say a few words about some of the further questions that this data raises for this phenomenon. The first is intra-ambassador variation and critical or angry tweets. So if we take one of these individuals I just showed you in the previous slide and we look at their critical or angry tweets over time, what are the time trends that we would expect to see there? Is it the case that people are very angry when they're first appointed and then they kind of mellow out, or do they tend to start out very friendly and then become more angry over time? And then also looking at variation in the type of angry tweet. So also previously I talked about the variation in how ambassadors would have these angry messages. Sometimes they would be direct messages written by the ambassador. Sometimes they're retweeting things by Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespersons. And sometimes they're retweeting critical commentary about foreign actors by foreign actors. So I think a further subdivision into who is, or further disaggregation into who is directly angry and who tends to be a bit more cautious and not expressing anger directly, but maybe retweeting some officially sanctioned messages of anger. That would also be very interesting work to do as well. And then I think for statistical analysis, there's a lot of really interesting questions that one could look at here. Is it where ambassadors tend to be based that makes them more likely to be critical or angry wolf warriors? Is it where they're at in their diplomatic career? Is it if it's their first posting or their second posting? Or maybe they're close to retirement and they just don't care what people think anymore because they know they're not going to get promoted. So they're willing to be angry all the time. Or maybe there's some other factors about their background that could be looked into to see if that would help to explain the patterns that we observe. And then I think a really logical question for people like myself who are quite interested in political mobility of different sets of Chinese elites is how these critical or angry tweets affect individual ambassador career trajectories. Now, it's a little bit early to be able to do this type of work simply because we're only looking at 29 ambassador Twitter accounts, and some of them have only been open for a short period of time. But I think if one were to look at a broader pool of diplomats or maybe follow these ambassadors over time, it'd be very interesting to see how these angry or critical tweets affect their likelihood of promotion. Conversely, maybe there's some type of professional red line for public criticism, where if you're too critical too often, then perhaps that's something that would impede your professional development. So finally, I want to talk about the domestic audience for Twitter diplomacy. So we think of it primarily as a way to engage foreign publics, but I think in this case, it's also definitely one of the intended audiences is Chinese citizens. And so by domestic here, I mean Chinese citizens who are based in China, as well as Chinese citizens who are living abroad or other Chinese diaspora communities. Oftentimes the Chinese citizens living abroad might follow the account of the Chinese ambassador in the country where they're living abroad. And so I think we can think of this so-called domestic audience of Chinese citizens or Chinese diaspora as extending far beyond China's borders as well. Now, for those Chinese citizens who are back in China, even if one does not have access to Twitter, which as we know is blocked in China, or necessarily have the language ability of a foreign language to be able to follow this closely, these ambassador tweets are still available for consumption by domestic audiences. So they are regularly translated and shared by domestic outlets, including the Global Times, Observer Network, on Weibo, and in other accounts. And so I wouldn't say this is incredibly common, but it was relatively easy to find examples of this occurring. And so I think that they are certainly reaching, frequently reaching large numbers of Chinese citizens in China who may not have Twitter at all and who may not have any foreign language ability. They are still being exposed to these messages. And also, of course, Chinese citizens in China who are able to access Twitter through various means, VPN or otherwise, as well as those living overseas, they are also able to directly follow the ambassadors' accounts and then view their tweets directly. And so here's one example of what I just mentioned, where a Chinese ambassador's tweet in English to a foreign language is translated by a domestic outlet, in this case, Observer Network, and really targeting a domestic audience. Now, there is a bit of a selection effect here in terms of the messages that tend to get shared and broadcast to the domestic audience. They do tend to be more critical messages, just like the one you see here. The title is U.S. mercilessly rejects Mexico's vaccine plea. Chinese ambassador, 4 pictures tell you who is a real friend. So quite clearly criticizing the U.S. response and positioning China as being the real friend of Mexico here. So we argue that ambassador tweets are aiming to promote a favorable public opinion, not only among foreign publics, but also domestic audiences at home and Chinese citizens around the world more broadly. And specifically, we see emerging out of these tweets by the ambassadors about COVID-19 in particular, and their pushback against foreign criticism directly through these critical statements and expressions of anger. They're combining together to promote a broader domestic narrative of success through sacrifice. And this is something that the ambassadors are very proud of and really push back on any criticism of. And these digital displays of anger also signal resolve to both domestic and foreign audiences. So showing them that the ambassadors are very much protecting China's reputation, its status, the policy choices that it made to foreign audiences. And so this is something that will reap political benefits back at home in China and among Chinese audiences as well. And so I just want to wrap up with some of the takeaways from this study so far, and then I'll speak briefly about additional research that we're doing in the ongoing study. So overall, we observe in terms of how China is using Twitter diplomacy to shape COVID-19 narratives, we see this combination of positive messaging about successful response in China, international cooperation, and together with criticism, I mean, really specifically of the United States, together promoting a narrative of China as a responsible international leader when it comes to not only the pandemic, but more broadly as well. And so we argue that this use of Twitter diplomacy by China aims to create a kind of informational counterorder. So using social media, instead of simply trying to globalize existing Chinese media outlets to other countries, enables Chinese diplomats to destabilize critical narratives about China and COVID-19 directly in the forums where criticism is generated. And so I think this is something really significant. I don't know how many of you have spent time in DC, and if you have, maybe you've walked past all of those newspaper boxes of the China Daily. Now, it's pretty easy to walk past them, even though they're there and they're very inexpensive. But if you're online in Twitter and there's critical narratives of China being generated, the Chinese ambassadors being right there on that forum, able to immediately retweet some critical commentary about China, add their own take, supplement it with their own messaging they want to put out there. And that's something that is very powerful. But we also see that these critical foreign narratives can be recast for domestic consumption and political benefit. through the translation of the tweets by outlets like Global Times, Observer Network, and the sharing on Weibo. And so this last point is maybe a bit less strong than the others, but I still think it's something interesting to think about. And that is that diplomats' use of Twitter contributes to more pluralistic, at least a Chinese official narrative of COVID-19. And so rather than only getting the talking points from Xi Jinping or Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and then everyone tweeting it out, there is some variation in terms of the individualized commentary that's coming out of these ambassadors. And so, yes, it is like a limited pluralization of the official discourse, but I still think it's significant that we're moving away from purely institutional voices on these debates to hear a little bit more from different ambassadors. And it certainly does seem that they do have very distinct individual voices, very different approaches to Twitter, a very different tone. And we looked at the tweets. We want to see, is there any coordination? Does it seem like all the ambassadors are retweeting the same thing from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs 5 minutes after it comes out? And to be honest, we found very little evidence of that. And so this is still a new space. I think regulation of it politically in China is constantly evolving as well. But for now, it does seem to be creating some interesting new spaces for Chinese ambassadors and these individual voices to really weigh in on some of these key policy debates. So let me talk a bit about some of the ongoing research that we're doing here, and then I'm happy to take any questions that you have and welcome your feedback on the study. So the first and most important thing that we're working on now is automating the content analysis. So I don't know if you've ever tried to manually code 33,000 Chinese ambassador tweets, but Nick and I have, and we can tell you that it is very time consuming. It took us about 1.5 years to finish all of that work, even meeting pretty regularly and really keeping up a good pace on it. Now, I don't think that this work has been in vain for the hand coding, because there are a lot of challenges of working with this data. Sometimes ambassadors tweet images and there's no commentary at all, or they might tweet a link and then you have to go to the link in order to see, oh, what is this that the ambassador's tweet is speaking about? And so I think there are some challenges that we need to be working through and are starting to work through when it comes to moving from hand coding to automation. But it's certainly not sustainable, I think, to continue, unless we had an army of, unless someone out there wants to give us millions of dollars and we had an army of other people who wanted to participate in this coding effort. But I think it's really wise to be trying to automate this analysis and using the hand-coded observations to be training the automated coding of tweets before. So related to that, we're also working on expanding the study timeframe through the present. So we presented today just the snapshot of time that we think really captures before the emergence of COVID-19, all the way through the trajectory of summer 2020 with the pandemic. But we're certainly interested in expanding that study timeframe through the present, as well as back to 2015 and those very earliest ambassador accounts, so we can capture the whole universe of Chinese ambassador tweets. And China's, even though today I'm speaking only about COVID-19, but China's Twitter diplomacy is actually primarily about other policy issues, and especially now, because the tweets about COVID-19 are declining, we're returning to a much more pluralistic use of this platform to engage foreign audiences about foreign policy issues. So 60% of the tweets are about these other topics. Some of the top ones that we've collected data on that we're working with and identified are China's Belt and Road Initiative, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Huawei and 5G technology, China's space program, and a number of other interesting topics. And so another thing that I haven't spoken about at all today, but which we have data on and are currently writing up as well, is analysis of Chinese ambassador Twitter account activity and engagement. So today I've been presenting to you what messages the ambassadors are putting out there, but if you're someone who is familiar with how Twitter works, that's not how it actually works. You put out your piece and then you get a lot of people who are commenting and engaging with whatever your message is. And so we have data on which of the tweets are the most popular, for example, so which are the ones that get retweeted and the most numbers of likes and engagements. And then we also have a lot of examples of interesting dynamics between ambassadors and other users. And that has to be a shock in terms of public diplomacy for Chinese officials. They're probably not used to having to deal with that type of public and direct criticism to some of the messages they put out there. And so that's something that we want to do as well, looking at different ambassadors and how the content they put out there is actually engaged with in a more interactive way. And that will give us a fuller picture, I think, of this Twitter diplomacy. And then finally, the analysis of wolf warriors and looking at variation among ambassadors as well as within single ambassadors' careers and messaging over time. So with that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much. If you don't have a chance to ask your question today, or you have other comments or questions you want to share with us directly, please get in touch. Please also add myself or my co-author, Nick, on Twitter, and email us. We welcome your comments, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Wendy. It's fascinating research. It's very carefully done. And so my question is going to be a typical question of someone who never did this kind of research, because I know that what I'm suggesting would be very arduous. And that is, have you considered looking at the foreign ministry spokespeople? I think when I think of the real wolf warriors, I think of the foreign ministry spokespeople, and I think of some sort of retired ambassadors at large who seem to chime in on any issue really early in foreign Twitter discussions in a kind of nasty and reactive way in many cases. And I wonder whether they could be factored into your analysis, because I realize the ambassadors are a finite and more measurable group, but it seems like the phenomenon of wolf warrior diplomacy is maybe larger and louder when you move away from the professional ambassadors who are at post. And then the second question I have has to do with the domestic audience, because I was struck by your introduction that, maybe one of the major themes of all this is public opinion at home. And I always thought of it more as the wolf warriors are trying to impress their domestic audience, which is really party members at home, about how loyal and how strident they are, but not the general public, simply because the general public doesn't have Twitter, because it's blocked. But you seem to be suggesting that there are intermediate channels where the public is actually exposed to foreign Twitter posts. And I didn't Twitter posts, foreign tweets, and I didn't I didn't know that. And maybe you could say a little bit more about how many of those sort of wolf warrior type tweets are presented to the public either in electronic media or on newspapers, because that's a revelation to me. So I'll start with that, and maybe some others can ask questions. I know Tom Narens has a question. Go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Tom, for those two questions. And I very much appreciate the challenge to expand it and make our analysis more comprehensive and more accurate as we look at this phenomenon. I also want to say, if Columbia would like to have a center of China's Twitter diplomacy, we're looking for sponsors for this. So if anyone out there wants to join this project, we would very much welcome that. And so to answer your first question, certainly I think that this is only a very small and narrow look at what is a broader phenomenon of wolf warrior diplomacy. And in addition, beyond the wolf warrior phenomenon itself, there's a number of other Chinese official actors that are using outlets, not only Twitter, but also Facebook, Instagram, and others. So that includes Chinese embassies, consulates, various Chinese missions. Now, when we think of the wolf warrior diplomacy, we think of people like Zhao Lijian or Chen Weihua, who's the EU bureau chief for China Daily. We think of these very opinionated individuals, and certainly I think that they are very important. And it doesn't, I don't want to make the point that the wolf warrior diplomacy has to be, everyone is angry all the time, because even those two individuals I just mentioned have very sophisticated and varying content in their messaging, even if a lot of it tends to be highly critical. And so I think we'd have a much better perspective of this phenomenon if we actually put it in context. And so what we're trying to do with our very small piece, which would be usefully expanded by looking at these other demographics as well, and going beyond just Twitter to look at different types of Western social media platforms like Facebook and Instagram, is to really make this fact-based, empirically grounded. So rather than talking about wolf warrior diplomacy and then citing a few examples of these individuals, really trying to get a sense of the whole range of the phenomenon and what it actually means for these individuals and for public opinion in foreign audiences. Now, to turn to your second question about the audiences back home in China, or we should say Chinese citizens who may also be living abroad as well, Now, this, I think, is one of the most important aspects of the project, but also one that has been the most difficult to collect data on and really get into from abroad. Before the talk started, I was explaining that one of the motivations for this study has been trying to diversify a research agenda on important issues related to China during a time when it's not possible for foreign citizens to physically be there doing research. And so I think this is certainly a weak area, and one that we're trying to build out is really understanding what these tweets might mean for domestic public opinion. Now, here's what we do know. I think we can assume from the examples that I've given and from what you've said, Tom, is that it's not reaching most Chinese citizens. Most Chinese citizens are not following what Chinese ambassadors are saying on their Twitter accounts and engaging foreign audiences. It's really the small subset of netizens who are already very engaged about China's reputation, about its status, its image internationally, and about its handling of key foreign policy issues, which include not only COVID, but also hot button issues like territorial disputes in the South China Sea. And so I think that the subset of messages that have been translated are really targeting those individuals, because we see they do tend to be much more critical messaging. And that's the demographic that would be, I think, looking and appreciating seeing that type of content from the diplomats of their country abroad. And there are things we could do to try to quantify that. I guess we could look at, Weibo and see how many people are engaging with different types of these translations and sharing of the Chinese ambassador messages. And that's something I hope that we'll be able to do in the future. And I certainly hope we'll be able to do that research back in China.
Yeah, thanks. I just to do a follow-up is that the wolf warrior diplomacy that strikes me as the most abrasive and the most counterproductive for China's international image are the ones where threats are made rather than kind of mocking. So the ambassador to Sweden is saying that we have guns for our enemies when they're criticizing China on human rights over a specific case, or perhaps worse still, disinformation spread by China. So they're saying Pompeo's spreading disinformation about COVID, but when they counter with, what about Fort Detrick? Didn't the disease come from Fort Detrick in the United States? Didn't an American military sports team bring it to Wuhan in the first place, and didn't it start in the United States? That kind of disinformation. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, what is the audience for that? Is that the kind of thing that gets reproduced within China? Is that the kind of thing that shows loyalty? I just wonder how you would interpret those kinds of tweets. Or maybe your study, it doesn't really cover that.
So again, it's hard to say how that particular type of message, right, the disinformation and threats are received back in China, because we don't have a whole lot of data. Even if I said to you, there's been 10,000 retweets of this, Chinese diplomat's tweet on Weibo, it wouldn't tell us very much about the actual consumption domestically of that. Mm-hmm. I think what our data does allow us to say is, hey, now we have 700 more examples of these angry tweets. So let's make a taxonomy and let's look at the types of messaging that are being put out there. Mm-hmm. And so you just mentioned two, right, disinformation and threats. And so if we can actually base our analysis of this messaging on the types of messages that are out there, and instead of just using words like angry or critical, be able to speak very specifically about these types of messaging, I think it's already a huge step in the right direction.
Thanks a lot. And I'll turn it over to others. I don't want to dominate the conversation. I think Daniel will handle the questions in Q&A. You can probably also read them, Wendy. Do you have access to the Q&A section?
I do. Sorry, I've been paying attention to the talk, so I'm just getting.
Let Daniel pick the ones, and then maybe you can read them aloud, or
It's good that you have access to it. I'm happy to read them so we have it on the record, so that there's some sort of recording of some of the questions, since they won't. This is for posterity on some level. First question comes from Tom Narins, who is the assistant professor of geography and planning at the University of Albany, and he asks, do you have any sense of why only 29 Chinese ambassadors have Twitter accounts or have tweeted about COVID-19? In your opinion, is there anything particularly significant about the countries from which these ambassadors are based? I know you touched on this a little bit anyway, but it's just a follow-up.
Yeah, Thank you very much for this question. So asking about what types of patterns we see of the subset of the 29 ambassadors who have chosen to create Twitter accounts during this period. To be honest, it's difficult to say. They really seem to be spread out all around the world. There's no obvious clustering in terms of regions or levels of economic development or types of bilateral relationship with the US or career stage of the ambassador. It really seems to be quite a mixed bag. So I think doing more individual level analysis about these individuals and really digging into their career backgrounds and their individual attributes, and then hopefully having more observations and being able to do some of this statistically and systematically would be informative. But no, we were also looking and asking that question and looking at the data. We don't see any really obvious patterns in terms of individual background. Well, I guess I could say one thing: they're all men, so that's something. But I mean, that's not affecting their likelihood to open a Twitter account. I mean, that's just the demographic of China's diplomatic corps and officials more generally. But other than that, and nothing specific about these particular ambassadors.
I think for a lot of these, at some level, the answer is going to be there's going to be more research to be done. As this is a very hot topic and this is kind of changing all the time. The next question is from Timothy Yin, who was a former Columbia Graduate School of Arts and Sciences student. And they asked, do you see angrier or more wolf warrior tweets getting more engagement? I know we touched on this a little bit as well. There might be a trade-off between how angry or persuasive a tweet is in and how much an engagement a tweet gets. Thoughts?
Yeah, so it's kind of surprising. We're just beginning the analysis of looking at the engagement about which tweets are most popular. And it's kind of surprising. I didn't talk at all today about another very common theme in the tweets overall, and those are simply examples of what could be termed distraction or diversion. So lots of pictures of a beautiful sunset and delicious meals that the ambassadors are enjoying. And sometimes it's these types of tweets that get the most engagement, or rather than any type of a hot button policy topic. And I think that's also because a lot of the people who follow the ambassadors are from those countries. And so there's a lot of resonance when the ambassadors tweet messages that might be specific to that country. And maybe they would be less likely, or some subset of them would be less likely to really be immobilized by hearing the ambassador's angry take. Because this is something we need to do, right? We need to look at the individual ambassadors. We have the data. So we can look at, for an individual ambassador, their follower base, where are those accounts located? And so we could start to look at, maybe the Chinese citizens or domestic audiences that might be most likely to really like those angry messages versus the more foreign users or followers who are often more likely to be liking and engaging with messages where they feel that the ambassador is somehow speaking to them directly through cultural messaging or culinary messaging with which they're more familiar. So we definitely need to do that type of work. Now, I do think that there is some type of red line when it comes to being too critical. And so most of the ambassadors have had their accounts completely uninterrupted since they first created them. But there was one example of Sun Weidong, who was the Chinese ambassador to India. And in August 2020, he had a high-profile Twitter fight with the Australian High Commissioner over South China Sea. And then his account kind of disappeared for a while, and now it's back. So there could also be some consequences for the ambassadors if they're too critical that don't have anything to do with the user engagement, but rather have to do with the platform or even behind the scenes back in Beijing, someone not being happy with how critical they were on the platform.
We have a question from Ian Johnson, who is the other co-director of the China in the World program based at Harvard. He has a couple questions. I'll just do two real quick. Is there any evidence that you see of interactivity between PRC ambassadors' tweets content and US government tweet content? And follow up, do you see any clear trends and change over time in critical wolf warrior content?
Okay, so on the first question about trends of engagement, yes, we do. And this is actually another thing that we really want to look at in the context of US-China relations specifically. And so a lot of times ambassadors will not only take the statements of their counterpart in the country where they're based, the US ambassador, and then retweet them with some commentary, but they'll often tag the US ambassador as well. And so we see that a lot more on the side of the Chinese ambassadors. I haven't looked systematically at US officials or ambassadors and their Twitter accounts, but my impression based on what I'm seeing is that they're not really doing so much of that. It seems to be much more an effort to try to, maybe not actually start a conversation, because we haven't really seen any back and forth between the American and Chinese ambassadors, but certainly to engage with their messaging on the platform and to try to call their attention to the things that the Chinese ambassador is saying and those points that they feel very strongly about that they've put out on Twitter. Your second question about the critical messaging over time. With regard to the COVID tweets, I don't have the data right in front of me, so I don't want to say anything too specific about the trend, but it did seem that the criticisms mounted over time. So in the beginning, there was a bit of a honeymoon period where even former President Trump was tweeting about how well China was handling the virus, and Pompeo was saying things that were a little bit more conciliatory. And then there really seemed to be a breakdown and an increase in angry tweets that paralleled that breakdown in bilateral relations. And then, to be honest, I think we could say that there certainly were a lot of missteps made by the US as well as China at different points in the pandemic. And so as those missteps became intensified in the US, there were more things that the Chinese ambassadors were critical about. And so the overall trend with the angry messaging related to COVID-19 specifically, and most of it targeting the US, was increased criticism over time.
Next question comes from a Matthew Murphy, who is a recent alum of the University of Southampton, who asks that much discourse about China's state-sponsored English language media with regards to Twitter's diplomacy and the Tell China Stories Well policy has been labeled as a proactive effort to propagate Chinese narratives to a global audience. Is there any space in your findings for an interpretation that this Twitter diplomacy is instead reactive to what China perceives as attacks on Chinese internal affairs? Both of those are in quotes. In the wider context of global criticism of China's handling of issues such as the South China Sea, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, the Indian border dispute, and Taiwan, with COVID-19 being an extension of this wider role within negative international reactions to China's rise?
Yeah, I think I absolutely agree with this question. So is it the case that China is trying to articulate an alternative informational order, or are they simply trying to destabilize the critical narratives about China that are out there in a more reactive way? And our findings suggest that it's absolutely the latter. Maybe it's an effect of how new the ambassadors are to this platform that might determine that. But we see a lot of elements of China's domestic censorship regime at play here as well. So I talked before about distraction and diversion. And so in addition to responding directly to the critical comments about China in the forums where they're generated by international actors, there is a lot of this distraction and diversion. So one of the tweets we had a good laugh about was the Chinese ambassador to Nepal had taken pictures of heart-shaped clouds in the sky, and that was, she was sharing that with the followers. We're like, what does this have to do with diplomacy, right? But a lot of it is that, it's distraction and diversion. And giving people, I haven't talked about Hong Kong or Xinjiang, but we do see a lot of tailoring there for host country audiences. So providing steady streams of positive information, about development, economic development, other achievements in these areas that are pushing back on the criticism of China when it comes to those issues, but not really articulating anything, very direct and clear in terms of China's position on them. So we argue that it's very much trying to create an informational counter order rather than an alternative informational order on this platform.
Our next question comes from a Shane Lin, who is a pre-doctoral fellow in the Fairbanks Center at Harvard University. When you are analyzing the influences of these trends, do you factor in, or do you find any significance related to the number of Chinese diplomats' Twitter followers as part of your assessment of the factors deciding their social media influence?
I honestly can't answer that question yet because we're just starting to work with the engagement data. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for you on that yet, but that's something that we're working on, is looking at which ambassadors have the most Twitter followers and then looking at the composition of their followers and then looking at how these trends have changed over time. So if someone tends to be more critical, what types of increases do we see in their numbers of followers over time? So the data on engagement is something that we're still putting together.
It just means we'll have to have you back for a follow-up talk about all of this.
Yes, and please do email me directly, and when we get to that part of the study, even if it's not published, I'd be happy to share that data with you directly.
Next question comes from Yuan Wang, who is one of our current CWP fellows this year, who is also jointly appointed with the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. She asks, my question is probably outside of your current research scope, but I'm wondering if these ambassadors have also Weibo accounts, and if so, are their Weibo accounts different from Twitter, and how so?
We have not done that, but I would love to. So maybe we could collaborate on that. Thank you for that question.
Next question comes from Eli Clemens, who's a master's candidate here at Columbia SIPA, who asks, I remember seeing analysis on Donald Trump's tweets in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago on what they were able to discern if his tweets under his official account were sent from his personal cell phone or an aide's phone or computer. Through this research, journalists were able to identify which tweets were likely written by Trump himself and which were likely written by his staff or other team members. Is figuring out if the diplomats wrote or sent these tweets themselves an area of your research that you have looked into and or would be useful?
Great, thank you for this question. And if I could just say one more thing to Yuan's previous question, I think that doing that type of paired analysis with the Weibo postings would be an excellent way to try to figure out what messaging it really matters to those domestic audiences and what type of variation we might see depending on who the ambassadors were speaking to. So to this question, we actually do have this data. So for every tweet in the data set, we can look at the platform on which it was generated. Now it gets a bit difficult because, I mean, if you're someone like me, who's a Twitter user, you start out your day maybe by lying in bed and scrolling through some of the tweets on your phone, sending out a message, and then you get into the office in the afternoon and you're bored and you have a cup of coffee and then you go on the platform on your laptop. So it's kind of like, I'm not sure exactly without following the ambassadors, they might be doing that also. But we do have data, and iPhone is one of them, or cell phone. And so that would be interesting maybe to just take a look at some of that data and see if we can notice any patterns, and also times of day, right? People tweeting really early in the morning or late at night when it's unlikely to be, well, maybe it's an overworked intern actually, who knows? But we do have that data, and I'm not familiar with the study you mentioned about Trump's tweets, but perhaps that would be a good starting point for us to see how they applied those different platforms to try to figure out which were by the top official or not, and we could take a look at our data in that way. We do have the information available to make those types of assessments.
Next question comes from, and I apologize if I get the name wrong, the pronunciation, Kevin Ladapong, who is a PhD student and associate instructor in anthropology at Indiana University. They have local grown. They have a question. As Western alliances seem to now be under a stronger umbrella under the under the Biden administration, does the Chinese government, do you think, might have a more tendency to divert away from traditional wolf warrior diplomacy that we saw under the Trump administration? Or would the opposite potentially be true based on your evidence? Might it intensify?
I think it's likely to intensify. And I think I'm not alone in making that assessment. Simply as the power position of China increases in its diplomats, they're not holding back. So unless there's some red line that's communicated and they're trying to avoid that because of their own political careers, I think in general, the trend has been one in which they are encouraged to tell China's stories well, and to protect China's interests on these platforms. And they're not holding back. I mean, they're definitely seem to be more critical over time. So I think like others, and based on the data that we've seen, in the case of COVID-19 as well as the other policy areas, we can expect more and more critical messages on Twitter as well as other social media platforms.
Daniel, did you get Tyler?
I'm about to do Tyler's.
Okay.
Yeah. Next question comes from Tyler Jost, who is another alumni of the program and is currently a professor at Brown University. And he asks, have you thought about how you might test the effects of these tweets on public opinion abroad? on other aspects of diplomatic effectiveness? Or have you also looked at, but if you have looked at this, what have you found?
Great. This is a really helpful question. And here I would actually direct Tyler and others who are interested in this question to a working paper by Daniel Mattingly and James Sundquist. And they have a paper that's available on Dan's website called "When Does Online Public Diplomacy Succeed? Evidence from China's Wolf-Warrior Diplomats." And here they are working with foreign policy audiences in India, and they actually take the real Chinese diplomat tweets, and then they show them to foreign policy audiences in India to try to get at this question. So I think this would be a great area for experimental research. We have not done it, they are already doing it, but I think that would be a really good way to try to get at and really systematically test, what the effects, of these messages are with regard to different foreign publics and also different sets of foreign policy issues, because Hong Kong issue might have a very different resonance in one country than another, and that could certainly be true for a lot of the different foreign policy issues that we're looking at.
Next question comes from Adam Liff, who obviously, Wendy, you will know, who's an associate professor of East Asian languages and cultures at the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University. And he asks, throughout your talk, you referred to the producers of the tweets as the ambassadors. I'm sorry if I missed it in your presentation, but do you know for sure who actually runs these Twitter accounts, which is a similar take on the previous question? If the authors may not be from the individual ambassadors themselves, IG persons who are also authorized to speak on their behalf from Beijing, do you think this might somehow factor into your analysis?
Yeah, I think it certainly does. And this is why it probably should be an urgent priority for us to really look through the different platforms of which the different tweets are generated. Yeah, I mean, we're operating on that assumption. I mean, I think as people who studied most of former President Trump's tweets or other types of Wolf-Warrior diplomacy messaging, we're all operating the assumption it's one that we could test. But I think it's pretty reasonable. Another thing I haven't said here is that there seems to be varying degrees of sophistication as well in this platform. So one might expect that the accounts would be handed off to whoever in the embassy has perfect English, and maybe they're the interpreter for English or whatever foreign language would be the one of the country the ambassadors are based. And that's not the case. Like they're a whole different, and English, of course, being only one barometer, not even the most important one in terms of engaging with this messaging, but there's various degrees of sophistication of expression, and also things like, so when there are the two meetings in China, sometimes ambassadors would be tweeting out, pictures of Xi Jinping and important quotes, some important speeches by Xi Jinping. And it was just kind of strange because I think outside of China, that type of messaging would have a lot less resonance. And then other messages were highly sophisticated and had, very, slick and well done short videos or, good sarcastic commentary or nice photographs. And people seem to be a whole range of sophistication in working with these platforms. But whether that's reflecting variation in ambassador ability or just the ability of whoever happens to be at the keyboard, that's something that we need to keep working on. But you're right, it is an assumption that we're operating on. It's one that we could test, and we should, and we will. Thank you.
Lots more research, I'm sure, on your part as this moves forward. The next question comes from Yan Bennett, a longtime friend of the program, former deputy director of the China in the World program, and current assistant director of the Paul and Marcia Weiss Center of Contemporary China at Princeton University. And she asks, I am wondering if you can tell us how much the ambassadors are retweeting and if the original tweets came from bots. And if so, what is the subject or topics of those bot tweets?
So most of the retweets tend to come from officially sanctioned sources. So they tend to be retweetments of statements by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokespersons or China Daily or Global Times. They don't look to be bots. They look to be ways that the ambassadors are trying to amplify existing official messaging on these topics. I would suggest that it's a kind of low cost, low risk strategy for the ambassador, especially when it comes to those angry tweets. So instead of penning your own angry missive about a US official, it's much safer to take the criticism that the foreign ministry has already sanctioned as being politically okay and then just amplifying that for your audience. So no, I haven't seen a whole lot of the bots. There is some variation in ambassadors. Some of them tend to be like clearly a lot of direct content generation, and then others tend to be like almost like totally retweet accounts. And so that's another thing that I think we should look at, and we are looking at in the engagement study, is how the platform is being used. There's also variation in how much the ambassadors want to engage the users. So sometimes they'll be very extensive, like they'll get down into the comments and they'll argue with people who disagree with them. And other ambassadors would never do that. And you get the sense that they're using it more as just a way to broadcast messages, often retweets from existing official sources, but not really as a more interactive tool.
You want to hop in, Tom?
I know I don't want to hop in. I just, are we done? I think that's all the questions, right?
I was going to ask one more follow-up from Ian Johnston.
Oh yeah, he had a couple more on the list, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Another question from Ian Johnson, once again, from Harvard University. Any evidence on how similar these patterns of tweets are from one country to another? And he specifically has curiosity about how they might relate to India. And then another question, and is there any evidence of the efficacy of positive or critical tweets on foreign opinion? The out of proportion awareness of wolf warrior tweets suggests that ambassadors tweeting are counterproductive outside of China. Thoughts on either of those?
Sure, yeah. Just clarification question on number 3. Would it be a comparison of tweets by ambassadors from India, or would it be looking at how these Chinese ambassador tweets play in India specifically?
I don't know for certain, but based off the way that the question is worded, it seems like he's referring to other government entities. So
Okay.
government officials and
That was my sense too, Wendy. I think Ian's asking you, like, is China unique in any way in this, or do other countries participate in the same kind of activities?
Oh, other countries absolutely participate in the same kind of activities at both national as well as subnational levels. So I think I agree with Ian that the most accurate thing would be to really match the Chinese diplomats with their counterparts, other ambassadors, because for the range of reasons that you mentioned earlier, Tom, as well, in challenging us to expand our study, a retired ambassador or diplomat's going to have a very different set of career incentives to engage in these conversations than someone who is still on the post or someone who is working for state-owned media, for example. So I think that would be really interesting work to do, or at least for the US ambassadors. I mean, maybe there's someone out there who's already done that for the US ambassadors as well. So I think making these comparisons cross-nationally is really valuable, and making sure that we're matching different types of diplomats would probably help us to draw more accurate inferences. I'm not sure if Ian's question had anything to do with India specifically, and again, to give free press to Dan Mattingly and James Sundquist's piece, they are looking specifically at India and at issues of territorial conflict and how these messages play in India specifically among the public. So I think that's a really interesting study, and I would certainly recommend it. And I've also shared the link directly in the chat box as well for others who are interested. Because we're trying to do a very thorough literature review of Twitter diplomacy related to China as well as other countries. And there actually isn't that much out there. So we're excited to be able to add to that conversation, but we're also very much looking to engage with these other studies as well.
It does seem, in the broader sense, it does seem that from the Pew polls starting in late 2019 before the pandemic and then getting worse after it, that China's global reputation is not very strong, despite the increased activity of its ambassadors, its diplomatic corps abroad. So, I mean, one could say that maybe this Twitter use and the wolf warrior diplomacy is failing, but there might be a lot of different reasons for why public opinion towards China has soured in the last few years that have nothing to do with actual diplomatic efforts by the foreign ministry in various countries. So it might be hard to determine the impact of Twitter itself on that.
That's right. And it could also be endogenous to the trend you describe, right? I mean, I think certainly with when COVID came down the pipe, they saw this was going to be a public relations crisis for China. And so there was already a move to digital diplomacy. But I think that acceleration, intensification of account creation at the very beginning of the pandemic is absolutely related to an effort to do PR damage control for something that appeared it was going to be very damaging to China. It turns out that that maybe it hasn't. We see that there is this trend of souring sentiment toward China in countries around the world. And so I think it's very interesting to do the type of experimental work that colleagues are doing, but also try to use as a baseline other cross-national polling of foreign publics on a range of foreign policy issues related to China, and see how that might compare.
There's just one last thought. It's not a question. Is that I've had a lot of students, graduate students, undergrads, writing on China's use of economic coercion in response to political criticism of the CCP at home or China's handling of sovereignty disputes. And one of the themes that comes out in this kind of work is that sometimes the target of the sanction may not be the direct target, but third country observers, so that you don't want to be the next Australia. Look out Malaysia, look out Indonesia. You could be the next Australia if you criticize us on Xinjiang or on COVID. And I wonder if there might not be something like that in wolf warrior diplomacy too, that they're blasting a foreign official in country X so that more timid foreign officials in country Y and Z might want to avoid making the same kind of criticism. I don't know, but it seems like a possibility in any case.
I think it absolutely is. And it's something about the way this platform functions that would enable those effects to take place. And so we're not talking about reporting in a national newspaper, in a single language, where we're talking about messaging that can be accessed by literally anyone in the world and can be translated with the click of a button. And so I definitely agree with you that this type of platform creates that potential for those types of third-party effects to occur in a way that other types of messaging, maybe more traditional messaging or prior to the digital age, simply would not permit or would make more difficult. I also want to say thank you to everyone for so many questions. I'm really grateful for all the different suggestions and comments and queries that you've raised, and just really excited to keep working on this project. It's pretty overwhelming because there's so many interesting things that we could do with the data, and it is such a large data set that we're building. But we're very excited to be working on these different aspects of it. And I say this on behalf of myself and also my co-author, Nick, who is here. And if you want to join us, please drop us a line. Want to do those paired studies, again, together looking at the Weibo accounts or any aspect of the work that we're doing, please do get in touch with us. And we really welcome and value your feedback. And I'm so thankful for everyone being here today.
So Wendy, one of the great signs of a successful session is when you have so many great questions that are following the talk. And this certainly applies to your session today. We're really thrilled to have you. Come back often as an observer or as a speaker, and we hope to have you at Columbia in person as soon as health conditions allow. So thanks a lot, Wendy.
Thank you so much.
One last housekeeping note before we take off. Our next event is actually next Monday on the 25th of October. We'll have an event with current fellow Yuan Wang, who actually asked a question earlier about Sino-African infrastructure cooperation. So please join us for that. Feel free to join our newsletter or follow us anywhere online. Check out our website. And thank you again for our speaker, Wendy Leutert. And just so you know, there's one last question from Ian Johnson, so you might want to follow up with him. He can ask you directly. But thank you so much for your time. Have a great day.
Thank you.